full screen.
Okay.
So guys, whenever you want, we have all the speakers on the session. So Danny, you are the chair, so you decide.
We are waiting for someone, or we can start?
Well, we could start, but I was hoping my colleague Dorrie would be here, but I don't know if she's having any problems or...
We can wait for 5 more minutes. So,
for 2 seconds, I'll see if she's...
Guys, after this session, the next one is at 2:30, so we have plenty of time. We have no problems to wait a little bit more as well. You are only 3 speakers, so we can wait.
Okay, I'll just enter a quick message, so hopefully...
yeah.
Dorrie's here because she's clapping.
I can hear a funny sort of sound in the background. Can anybody else hear that? Oh, it's gone now.
Yes, I'm going to mute all the videos.
All right, I think Dorrie is here. So shall I make a start?
Sure, Adam, you can unmute yourself.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone, for having us here as well. Hopefully my colleague Dorrie is here. I think she is here as well, under a different name down the bottom. So my name is Adam Eldridge, and I'm here with hopefully Dorrie Chetty and our other colleague Naya Hussein as well. And the paper that we're going to be looking at today then is called It's Therapy and It's Fun, Late Night Hair Salons in London. So what we want to do then is talk about some research that we've been doing for around about 18 months now, on and off, of course, which is about late night hair salons that are open in London. So we've been particularly looking at salons which stay open beyond normal retail hours in London, which normal retail hours in London are still around about 9 to 6 p.m. So the salons that we've been looking at have been where we've been doing interviews and observing and conducting interviews are typically open till around about 8-ish, or for a little bit longer. Not always, some of them are open till about 10, 11 or 12. We know of one salon which is open till 3 o'clock in the morning, but we still haven't managed to actually secure an interview there. So our interest in hair salons came from a couple of different individual interests. My own work, of course, is about the night, and I'm very interested in the night in terms of debates around community, around belonging, and around work as well. My colleague Dorrie Chetty's work is largely about migration, about development, and about gentrification in London. She's also very interested in how migrants come to belong and feel a sense of community as well. So for this particular project, for our research on the hair salons, she was looking at the role of the salons in maintaining as well various ethnic cultures and their impact on the local economy, and also how regeneration potentially might affect this, and the role and the implications of that for cohesion and inclusion in the wider community. And up the top there as well is our other colleague, Naya Hussein, who's conducting research in London on a housing estate, and she looks into young people and gentrification and regeneration as well. So where the project actually come from was a number of years ago, I was doing a late night escorted walk in Brixton, and one of the things that I noted was that apart from restaurants and clubs and bars, the only other stores that seemed to be open later at night at around 9, 10 o'clock were these hair salons. So my interest in the night, Dorrie's and I, sort of came together around this question of what's going on in these salons as well. Many of them that were open were largely catering to the Black and Asian minority communities as well. So just a couple of very quick backgrounds as well to around the same time that we were starting this research as well. A report was came out from the Greater London Authority. About a third of Londoners are working at night. Now, it's a fairly early cut-off time of 6 p.m, but it's around about a third of Londoners typically work after 6 p.m, which of course raises a number of questions about who works when, how this is marked by class, gender, race, age, etc. as well. And also, for again, my own interest is what effects this has on domestic life, on leisure schedules as well, and on generally on. A survey found was that around about 65% of Londoners are active at least one night a week, and for 42%, which is actually the main figure, for 42%, the main activity was running errands or shopping, which of course also included having a haircut. So out of these observations and in our interests, our questions were simply, what is the role of hair salons in terms of community at night? And I'm particularly interested in, well, what does this mean? What does community mean? And, you know, one of the things I'm interested in with this is working through the terminology about community encounter, rubbing up, looking at different kind of terminologies and ways of thinking about and explaining communities at night as well and how they're practiced. The other question then is, what can these salons reveal about the ways time and domestic life are organised in the late evening and into the night as well? So this is really about the spatial and the temporal organisation of communities' working lives, including the significance of hairdressers and hair salons and other spaces in that. So to do the research, what we did was we looked at 3 areas in the north, the southeast, and in the south of London as well. And mainly Dorrie and Naya conducted interviews, and we did observation as well. So what I want to do today is just present just a couple of 4 findings that we've had so far, bearing in mind that we only really finished the interviews in February, and then we kind of went down into lockdown. So there's a lot more analysis and a lot more research to do on this as well. So anyone who's familiar with the work around hair salons will know there's been quite a lot of discussion about their importance as social spaces and as hubs in the local community. So of course there's Oldenburg's work on third places, for example, which refers to hair salons as one of those good places, which are not spaces of the home, they're not spaces of work, they're another type of kind of public space. And I've heard recently that people are now talking about fourth places as well. And our title very much reflects Oldenburg's point as well. It's therapy and it's fun came from one of our managers that we interviewed, and she suggested that people came to her salon because it is a sort of leisure space, it's a fun space, and also it's very much about therapy as well. It's where people come to have their hair cut, but also, of course, to chat about their lives, share news, buy products, and gossip as well about things happening in the local area. So the idea then that hair salons can be therapeutic and community spaces or important in terms of their function in the local area is therefore quite well known. But what we're really interested in is, well, what does this actually mean? What does this mean in practice? What does it mean, particularly as well, given the very high population churn in certain parts of London, and what does this mean about in terms of how communities get made? And again, it's that kind of question that we're thinking about the terminology of community, of practice, of encounter, of rubbing along. What do these terms mean in this context? And of course, finally as well, what difference does the night make? So what is the significance of the night? Why are these spaces open very late at night? Sometimes, as we said, we know one that's open till 3, but typically around about 8 to 10 o'clock that they're closing at night. So firstly, then, just as some theoretical background to this as well, because of that very well documented issues around regeneration and gentrification that's been happening in London, particularly in the areas that we were looking at, one of the questions we asked was, what would it actually mean for the salon not to be there? What would actually be lost? I mean, how do you lose a community? What does the loss of a community mean under these conditions of urban change as well? So knowing then that familiar line that salons were important hubs within the community, we wanted to know what was actually under threat here. So we drew primarily on the work of Emma Jackson and her recent work around bowling alleys, also the work of Blockland, Susie Hall's work, of course, and also Ural Davis as well. And we, again, drawing on the work of particularly Emma Jackson as well and her work on bowling alleys, we approached the salons as spaces of conviviality, defined by Paul Gilroy as the processes of cohabitation and interaction that have made multiculture an ordinary feature of urban life in Britain. So given that sense of that, then that cohabitation, that interaction, that rubbing up, that spaces of encounter of London's multiculture, so we avoided then that idea of community as a singular thing in its own spatial or temporal vacuum, but as something that was entangled with various other spatial, temporal, political, economic factors that were constantly changing it as they were constantly changing the area as well. So just a couple of key findings then, and the first one then is that issue around them being landmarks for new and also for established residents as well. And this was perhaps the most significant finding, was that of course they're very important spaces really also for employment for local people, but as well as sharing knowledge and information for new arrivals to the area. Happen during the day, of course, but also very much at night as they become much more like community hubs, providing points of connection as well between, and I put this in inverted commas, strangers and residents, as well as both anchors of home and new homes as well. And one of the managers that we spoke to in the north of London alluded to the fact that how people from Jamaica knew how to get straight on the Piccadilly line from Heathrow, change to the Victoria line and come straight up to his salon. So the other evidence around this was about television screens that were screening programs from elsewhere, as well as materials available like hair care products, sharing information about schools, sharing information about housing, about employment, about local products. So this was especially important for the people who had just moved to the area. So they enabled, in a sense, this kind of constant reproduction and making a community, creating kind of, and again, we haven't really finalized this, but thinking about those sort of relations of proximity between strangers and residents, between new and established communities. So the 2 points that we can draw from this as well is firstly drawing from Hannah Lewis's work as well about how integration occurs in spaces other than simply formal institutions like education, housing or employment. So integration and introduction also occur in more fragmented ways, spatially, but also very much through the body as well. And this is something that we're very interested in, about how there's a certain level of trust and embodied connection as well, in terms of the intimate act of people actually touching our hair, of actually sitting there as well. So what is sometimes referred to as aesthetic labor is through this also an act of building and developing intimacy through new or repeated visits. So it's the kind of networking that seems to happen gradually over time. So the figure of the stranger, again, is quite significant here, that unlike much of our kind of rubbing along, to borrow from Susie Hall's work or Sophie Watson's work, is here actually being kind of physically stuck, if you like, in a chair for maybe 20 minutes to 3 hours in some cases, as our hair is cut, styled, dyed, and washed with other strangers. Secondly then, and coming back to that point about community, the salons functioned, of course, very importantly as places where multiple communities, new, established, emerging, would overlap, and where the connections sustaining them, of course, existed both within and outside the space itself. And maybe something we can come back to a bit later was a very interesting comment from a white French woman. In her salon, suddenly became very, very popular with local black gay men, and was thinking about the sort of connections that were happening there as well. So the salons acted very much as kind of like a third space that was in some ways was non-threatening to new arrivals, even though they kind of are, because, you know, people are cutting our hair, trying to make us not look silly, but also acting very much as a lubricant as well to ease that encounter between new individuals and families, between established communities and new ones, and as spaces there where bonding and trust could be developed. The second point was, of course, about as a place of dialogue, if you like, for exchanging news. And what's interesting about them, of course, is that they're quite different to pubs. They're quite different to maybe cafes. It's not like we phone up 5 of our friends and say, let's go hang out in the local hair salon. They're not really communities of taste necessarily either. And because of that presence of new members, they're not communities always where there are clear rules of inclusion and exclusion, or maybe there are, but it's interesting to think about how those function. Now, this doesn't mean that the relations here are, of course, loose. They're informal, but they're not informal in the sense of being informed by rigid structures or time of place. Instead, what we found was that there are places where meeting up is much more spontaneous, much more fragmented, where topics of conversation could move quite quickly between, say, swapping photographs of children, what's happening in the neighborhood, to broader questions about regeneration that's happening in the local neighborhood as well. So there are spaces as well where lots of local tensions were also, and lots of local debates were also had as well. So in a sense, they become both a place of belonging and comfort, but also for learning and maybe discomfort as well. A third, and coming to the fourth one as well, the third one was that they actually, of course, also do actually function as spaces of refuge as well. And this could be like a safety space in terms of a valve where important issues were in the local community were debated and discussed, but also actually literal spaces of safety as well. And one of the salon managers told us about a young man who was being chased by some other kids who basically came into his salon as well. And a similar case happened in another part of London as well, of being open at night. They function almost as like semi-kind of community caretakers as well for people to take refuge. That final point then is about the domestic and the public. And it very much depended upon the size of the salon, and some of them were really tiny, like really, really tiny, with just one chair, but some of them were much, much larger. And in those much larger spaces, there was, again, I don't want to say a blurring, but a kind of different mapping, if you like, to domestic and public activities as well, things like eating. There were stories as well of parents who might drop their kids off in the salons before they then went off shopping and then picked them up a bit later. In some ways, we can say that perhaps they're functioning as substitutes for all the community spaces, which of course our Tory government have, because of austerity, for example, over the recent years, closed down. So they become really quite active and quite busy spaces as well as in the evening. And one of the managers told us that he would quite often have to go out. He would see people coming up to the door, having a look in, walking off, and he would have to go out and say, no, 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 they're just here to chat. There's not a queue. You can come straight in and get your hair cut. So there's got a number of questions here again as well about sort of the number of people who are working late at night as this increases, and often in precarious labour, that these salons also become spaces where there's a clear kind of extension, if you like, of domestic space after dark, such as through eating and such as through childcare, but also as places to pop in, places to shop, and places to socialise as well. So just some final comments then. So just thinking of these themes, it's worth re-emphasising that the communities that we're referring to are constantly coming and going. There are clients and salon managers who've known each other literally for years, right from childhood, and then been cutting the same hair for people as they go through the life course, but also as introductory spaces for new residents as well. So there are very different ways in the community that an intimacy was being practiced through bodily intimacy, as working as introductory spaces, as places of discussion, of safety, as well as places for tasks that were otherwise coded as private and domestic, such as perhaps eating and childcare as well. So a lot has already been said about community and about salons as community spaces, but what we're trying to do with our project is thinking about what does this mean, and thinking about the terminology of this as spaces of encounter of community, as practices of community as well. And equally then we're interested in how these salons provide also other types of sociable spaces for people to meet at night, both introducing and therefore strengthening different forms of community as well. Obrigado.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Laura-Solmaz Litschel, and I'm a research fellow and PhD candidate in a project which is called Night Spaces, Migration, Culture and Integration, and has therefore the acronym NIGHT. You might have heard from us since some of my colleagues presented yesterday. We are funded by the Humanities in the European Research Area Network, which consists of 26 national funding agencies, and we conduct research in England, Ireland, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Germany, mostly on different matters of nightlife and migration. I am based at the Institute for Migration Studies in Berlin and at the Center for Digital Cultures at Leuphana University Lüneburg. My lecture today has the title Transformers of the Urban Night, Platform Labor, Migration and Smart City. Let me first give you a short outline of my presentation. I am going to start with the theoretical framework, then I introduce you to my research field. I'm going to follow up with my research question, and afterwards I will present our first findings, and I'm going to end with the conclusion. In my work, I bring the wide field of night studies together with some considerations about digitalized work. The ongoing extension of daytime activities into the urban night was widely discussed under terms like 24/7 city, for example. Some were even claiming that the colonization of the night is happening. First Murray Malbon in 1987. There have also been considerations on the colonization of sleep for the purpose of never-ending time for accumulation, like Jonathan Crary made in 2013. Drivers of this ongoing extension of the day into the night are, among others, the flexibilization of working hours, the outsourcing across time zones, the expansion of street lighting, night traffic, nightlife, and of course the service sector. Today I want to draw attention on this last mentioned phenomenon and its acceleration through digitalization. The expansion of the service sector has become even more crucial for the transformation of nocturnal urban space through the expansion of the so-called platform-based services. With that, I mean the rise of online platforms that we all know, like for example, Uber, Airbnb, or Lieferando. In 2020, the ubiquitous day of the internet offers most city dwellers 24/7 the opportunity to order all kinds of services through digital apps. Examples would be, like I've already mentioned, food delivered by Lieferando, mobility provided by different ride or car sharing providers, or housing, for example, provided by the platform Airbnb. Online platforms in general are, unlike classical stores, always open. and invite customers to consume day and night. Therefore, practices of nighttime shopping for services on digital platforms are increasingly shaping urban life. Important keywords in this context in order to classify the expansion of the platform sector theoretically would be terms like digital or platform capitalism. The rise of online platforms is closely linked to the concepts of the so-called smart city, as they often create highly networked digital environments through an expansion of technological infrastructure. Using the example of urban transport, I would like to show today how disruptively the rise of the mobility platform sector transforms nocturnal Berlin. Let's first take a look at the transformation of Berlin's public night transport. In the 1930s, the night network consisted of a few trams and buses. Today, Berlin has a unique and very broad nocturnal public transport system, which is particularly expansive. Even though public night transport in Berlin is very well developed, there is still a demand for more, especially for the so-called last mile, which brings people right to their doorstep. There are numerous mobility platforms that complement the public transport offer through car, bike, and ride sharing. This slide here shows most of the mobility providers who are active in Berlin right now. The expansion of platform-based mobility and the development of the infrastructure that it has brought with it had a great influence on public debates about urban space. Especially e-scooters were widely discussed in the press because they were spread over the entire city, blocking sidewalks, or were even thrown into the river Spree. On this slide here, we see an example from my online research on Facebook. A platform worker who is working as an e-scooter recharger is commenting the picture saying, "Traffic concept of Berlin shown in one picture." As one response to this chaos, Berlin's public transport provider BVG has developed an app called Yelby. And this app Yelby is quite unique because it's a joint venture between mobility platform providers and the classical public transport. Within the app, it's possible to combine and compare mobility options of the private platforms with the public transport. So within the app, you can combine e-scooter ride, bike, or car sharing routes with the tram or the subway. So through the incoming journey inquiries in the app, the BVG gains access to mobility data of the app users. With the so gained data, the BVG adjusts its nighttime offer, because on basis of that data, it can be seen where the demand for nocturnal transportation is here in Berlin. This data is therefore translated into concrete infrastructures, which are transforming public space. For example, on basis of the data, the BVG started in the last years to build stations in high demand traffic zones for vehicles of the platform providers next to the public transport stations. Of course, the infrastructure expansion of nocturnal transport creates a huge demand for maintenance labor, which is shaping Berlin at night. Migrant workers are often the backbone of this mobility infrastructure, working at night to ensure daytime mobility of others. Our empirical research concentrates on this migrant nocturnal platform labor. We are asking firstly how Berlin's night is transformed by app-distributed labor, and secondly, what social figures this new digitized urban night produces. So why research digital distributed labor in context of night and migration studies? One reason would be that this work is often performed at night. It's, for example, combined with the regular 9-to-5 job. Many platform workers work in the platform business after the regular job ends to gain extra money, or because the salary of their main job is just not sufficient. Another reason is that it's very precarious work. It's often self-employed, and evening work and night shifts are very common. It's often conducted by migrants, which have, due to working regulations or structural discrimination, a harder time to enter the employment market. And this kind of app is more or less easy to access. This kind of work is more or less easy to access. You just need to download the app. Then you have perhaps one welcome meeting where you sign a contract, but normally you do not need to prove your qualifications. So we decided to start with the investigation of e-scooter rechargers. Their maintenance work takes mostly place at night according to regulations made by the company. They collect the e-scooters at night and have to bring them back before 7 in the morning. Actually, they recently changed that, so it's not any more pure night work, but still the night is mostly when it happens because there's just less traffic. The e-scooter rechargers are very visible at night, driving around with trailers or load wheels and collect the scooters. Also, the e-scooters themselves are changing urban space with their lights. If you do a night walk in nocturnal Berlin, you will see all the green and red lights blinking into the darkness. E-scooter rechargers get all the working instruction from a downloaded app. And this app is often the only contact to the company they are having during their work. So the algorithm serves more or less as their boss replacement. E-scooter rechargers are therefore maintaining smart city mobility infrastructures while relying on smart city infrastructures like 4G internet, street networks, street lighting, and therefore they are a very urban phenomenon. Usually this work is paid per piece and the earning is dependent on how many scooters they have collected and loaded. But since some companies are starting to work with subcontractors, it is even getting more complicated. Sometimes it's an hourly payment, often there's just an even lower payment per piece than we had before that. The e-scooter rechargers do not receive any working equipment, like a transporter, storage, warehouse. So they have to provide everything themselves and load the e-scooters at home or in self-rented places. Let me shortly present our first findings. Just to add, we recently started our fieldwork, so this is the work in progress. One finding would be that they, in this context, often become users of other service platforms themselves. For example, they have to rent a trailer because the company is not providing anything for them. So they use a car sharing platform or another German sharing platform, which is called eBay Kleinanzeigen, and rent a trailer there. Or they use Airbnb because they need a place to recharge the e-scooters. So they're using other platform services at night. So other platform workers, again, have to work at night to provide service for them. So they become so-called prosumers, a mixture between producer and consumer of the platform economy, shifting between different platforms in order to be able to guarantee their work. Here on this slide, we see 3 posts made in a Facebook group founded by e-scooter rechargers in Berlin. In this group, they are sharing their thoughts and concerns regarding their work. Sometimes they are also joking or initiating competitions, like it's the case in the first post on the slide, where a man proudly presents how many e-scooters he has collected, provoking others to follow his example. The use of social media platforms have become a very important strategy for individualized platform workers to come together online, discuss experiences and strategies. And a last finding that I would like to share today is the practice of account sharing. Due to working regulations regarding citizenship or the need to have a trade certificate here in Germany, there is a flourishing market for account sharing. Here, a person is trying to rent a German account and is willing to pay the owner of the account a commission for that. So this practice is quite common among migrant platform workers, and this is also happening in other platform companies. So my colleagues told me this is also happening in the cleaning business, for example, offered by companies like Helpling, or the ride-sharing business offered by Uber, for example. So since I do not have much time today, let me conclude now. The expansion of the nighttime transport has numerous effects on nocturnal space. Infrastructural expansion of public transport is no longer limited to the expansion of railway and tram networks. It's furthermore spread over the entire area. The expansion of the platform sector has numerous further effects on the nocturnal city. It is getting brighter. People are on the streets as workers or as customers, and it's always possible to get from A to B at any time, even beyond classical public transport schedules. Warehouses are built to store and recharge vehicles. Labor migration takes place. Workers use social media and online platforms at night to share experiences and working strategies, rent equipment, or share accounts to be able to perform their work. Since I do not have much time today, as I already said, I would like to end for now. I'm very interested in your comments, and I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you.